Have you ever wondered if the strangest creatures on Earth are more unbelievable than science fiction? How is it possible that an animal can survive after losing its head? Why can some creatures completely regrow parts of their bodies as if nothing ever happened? How can life exist in the darkest depths of the ocean where sunlight has never reached? Which animal has blue blood? Which one has three hearts? Is there really a creature that barely seems to age? How can some tiny animals survive the freezing cold, boiling heat, and even the vacuum of space? Which animal can disappear right before its predator's eyes? How do some creatures generate hundreds of volts of electricity, while others are immune to some of the world's deadliest poisons? What animal can change both its color and texture in just seconds? And what if the most extraordinary creatures on Earth aren't the ones you've heard about, but the ones almost nobody talks about? These aren't myths. They aren't science fiction. They are real animals living on the same planet as us. In this video, we'll uncover the world's most extraordinary creatures, reveal the incredible abilities that make them unique, and explore the astonishing secrets of nature that continue to amaze scientists to this day. Get ready to discover animals that will completely change the way you see life on Earth. The story of the dodo is one of the most quietly unsettling extinction narratives in human history, not because it unfolded in deep prehistory, but because it happened in the early modern world, at a moment when human expansion was accelerating faster than ecological understanding. The dodo, scientifically known as Rhapis cucullatus, was a large, flightless bird that lived exclusively on the remote island of Mauritius in the Indian Ocean. For millions of years, the species evolved in near total isolation. With no natural mammalian predators on the island, the dodo developed in an environment where fear-based survival behaviors were largely unnecessary. It grew heavy-bodied, ground-nesting, and remarkably unwary of large animals. From an evolutionary standpoint, this made perfect sense within the stable ecological bubble of Mauritius. But the very traits that once made the dodo successful would later become fatal vulnerabilities. When Dutch sailors first arrived on Mauritius in the late 16th century, they encountered a bird that had never learned to fear humans. Contemporary accounts describe the dodo as approachable, slow-moving, and easy to capture. Early visitors often portrayed the bird as clumsy or foolish, a characterization that would later shape the dodo's enduring cultural reputation. However, modern ecological analysis suggests the bird was not inherently unintelligent. It was simply adapted to an environment that had never required rapid escape behavior. The true danger did not come from direct hunting alone. Although sailors and settlers did kill dodos for food, the more devastating impact came from the ecological shock that followed human arrival. Ships brought with them rats, pigs, monkeys, and other invasive species that quickly spread across the island. Unlike the adult dodos, which were large and somewhat resilient, their eggs were extremely vulnerable. Ground nests that had once been safe for millennia suddenly became easy targets for newly introduced predators. This shift triggered a classic but devastating ecological cascade. Dodo reproduction rates, already relatively slow, could not keep pace with the new level of egg predation. At the same time, human settlement gradually altered the island's vegetation, further reducing the bird's stable habitat. What makes the dodo's decline especially haunting is how quickly it appears to have unfolded. Within less than a century of sustained human presence, reliable sightings of the bird became increasingly rare. By the late 17th century, the dodo had effectively vanished. The exact date of the final individual's death is unknown, which in itself is psychologically revealing. Unlike later extinctions that were documented in real time, the dodo disappeared during a transitional period when global exploration had expanded, but systematic biological monitoring had not yet matured. In other words, the species slipped through the narrowing window of early modern awareness. Another striking aspect of the dodo story is how its cultural image diverged from its biological reality, because many early European descriptions emphasized the bird's tameness and awkward movement. The dodo quickly became a symbol of foolishness in popular imagination. Over time, the phrase "dead as a dodo" entered common language, reinforcing the idea that the species' extinction was somehow inevitable or even deserved. Yet this interpretation obscures the deeper lesson. The dodo did not fail because it was poorly designed. For millions of years, it was perfectly adapted to its environment. What changed was the speed and scale of external pressure introduced by humans and their accompanying animals. The extinction of the dodo was not the result of evolutionary incompetence. It was the result of ecological mismatch created almost overnight. Modern research has also revealed how incomplete early records of the dodo actually were. No fully preserved soft tissue specimen survives from the period when the species was alive. Much of what we know comes from fragmentary remains, subfossil bones, and artistic reconstructions of varying reliability. Even today, the exact appearance, posture, and behavior of the living dodo remain partially reconstructed through scientific inference. This fragmentary legacy adds another layer of unease to the story. The dodo is both one of the most famous extinct animals and one of the least directly observed in life by modern scientific standards. It became iconic precisely because it vanished at the threshold of the modern biological age. From a broader historical perspective, the extinction of the dodo marks an early warning signal in the emerging pattern of human-driven biodiversity loss. It demonstrated long before the industrial era reached full momentum that relatively small and geographically isolated ecosystems could collapse rapidly under combined pressure from hunting, invasive species, and habitat disruption. At the time, however, the story of the passenger pigeon is one of the most shocking population collapses ever recorded in modern history, not because the species was rare or fragile, but because it was once the most abundant bird in North America. At its peak in the early 19th century, the passenger pigeon, scientifically known as Ectopistes migratorius, existed in numbers so vast that early observers struggled to describe them without sounding exaggerated. Flocks were reported to stretch for miles across the sky, sometimes taking hours to fully pass overhead. Contemporary accounts describe the sun being briefly darkened by the sheer density of birds in flight. In ecological terms, the passenger pigeon was not merely common, it was dominant. For thousands of years before large-scale European settlement, the species thrived across the eastern forests of North America. Its survival strategy depended heavily on massive flocking behavior. Passenger pigeons nested, migrated, and fed in extraordinarily large colonies, a pattern that provided strong protection against natural predators. When millions of birds moved together, individual risk was diluted. This strategy had been highly successful in the pre-industrial ecosystem, but it also created a hidden vulnerability that would only become apparent once human pressure intensified. The pigeon's entire reproductive system was optimized for abundance. They nested in dense clusters, often concentrating huge portions of the population into relatively confined areas during breeding season. What had once been a strength became a catastrophic weakness when confronted with industrial-scale hunting. By the mid-19th century, technological and economic changes dramatically altered the balance between humans and wildlife. Expanding railroad networks allowed hunters to reach remote nesting sites quickly and transport massive quantities of birds to urban markets. The telegraph system enabled near-instant communication about flock locations, turning pigeon hunting into a highly coordinated commercial enterprise. At the same time, deforestation across the eastern United States began reducing the vast hardwood forests that the species depended on for food and nesting. Unlike earlier subsistence hunting, this new industrial approach removed birds at a scale the species had never faced in its evolutionary history. What makes the passenger pigeon's decline particularly disturbing is the speed of the collapse. In the early 1800s, billions of birds filled the skies. By the 1870s, observers were already reporting noticeable declines. By the 1890s, large flocks had become rare, and in 1914, the last known passenger pigeon, a female named Martha, died in captivity at the Cincinnati Zoo. In little more than a human lifetime, the most numerous bird in North America had been driven to extinction. This rapid transition from overwhelming abundance to absolute absence stunned even many observers at the time. It exposed a dangerous assumption that had quietly shaped human thinking: the belief that extremely large populations were effectively inexhaustible. Psychologically, the passenger pigeon represents a different kind of extinction story than the dodo. The dodo was geographically isolated and numerically limited. The passenger pigeon was everywhere. Its disappearance forced a painful recalibration of human perception. It demonstrated that scale alone does not guarantee survival when exploitation becomes industrialized. In fact, the species' reliance on massive flocking may have accelerated its downfall. As populations shrank, the bird's social breeding system began to break down. Passenger pigeons required large colony sizes to successfully reproduce. Once numbers dropped below a certain threshold, their recovery became biologically difficult even without continued heavy hunting. This phenomenon, now known as the amaze effect, was not understood at the time. The final years of the passenger pigeon are especially haunting because they unfolded within the era of photography and modern record-keeping. Martha, the last known individual, lived out her remaining years under human observation. When she died on September 1, 1914, the extinction of the species was no longer an abstract scientific conclusion. It was a documented event. Her preserved body now rests in the Smithsonian Institution, a silent physical reminder of how quickly abundance can collapse under sustained pressure. In the decades that followed, the passenger pigeon became one of the most frequently cited examples in early conservation movements. It helped shift public awareness toward the realization that human activity could eliminate even the most numerous species. Yet the lesson came only after the window for recovery had fully closed. Today, the passenger pigeon exists only in museum drawers, historical accounts, and ecological models. But its story continues to carry an uncomfortable warning that feels increasingly modern. In Campo, the story of the great auk is one of the clearest and most sobering examples of how human pressure can eliminate even a well-established and widely distributed species when exploitation becomes systematic and sustained. The great auk, scientifically known as Pinguinus impennis, was a large, flightless seabird that once inhabited the cold North Atlantic, nesting on rocky islands from eastern Canada and Greenland to Iceland, the British Isles, and parts of Scandinavia. For thousands of years, the species thrived in this harsh maritime environment, perfectly adapted to life in frigid waters where its powerful swimming ability allowed it to hunt fish with remarkable efficiency. On land, however, the great auk was slow, upright, and completely unable to fly, a combination that would ultimately seal its fate once humans began to harvest it at scale. Physically, the great auk stood nearly a meter tall, with a distinctive black and white plumage pattern and small vestigial wings that functioned more like underwater stabilizers than instruments of flight. In many ways, it resembled modern penguins, although the two were not closely related. The auk's evolutionary strategy depended on isolation and predator-free breeding grounds. It nested in dense colonies on remote rocky islands where large terrestrial predators were historically absent. Like many island-breeding seabirds, it evolved with little behavioral fear of land-based threats. This ecological innocence had once been advantageous, conserving energy in environments where constant vigilance was unnecessary. But as with several other extinction stories, the arrival of organized human exploitation transformed this adaptive calm into a fatal vulnerability. For centuries, indigenous peoples and early European sailors harvested great auks for meat, oil, and feathers. Initially, these activities were relatively small in scale and did not immediately threaten the species' survival. The real danger emerged as commercial demand intensified during the 17th and 18th centuries. The bird's dense feathers became highly valuable for stuffing mattresses and pillows, and their predictable nesting colonies made mass harvesting disturbingly efficient. Sailors and hunters could land on breeding islands and capture large numbers of birds with minimal effort. Because the great auk could not fly and had limited mobility on land, entire colonies could be devastated in a single season. As exploitation increased, the species entered a familiar but poorly understood downward spiral. Fewer breeding adults meant fewer eggs laid. Fewer colonies meant remaining birds became easier to locate and harvest. In some cases, collectors specifically targeted the last remaining individuals for museum specimens, ironically accelerating the final phase of extinction in the name of scientific preservation. By the early 19th century, the great auk had become increasingly rare across much of its former range. Yet, as in many extinction narratives, the seriousness of the decline was not fully recognized until the population was already critically low. The final confirmed chapter of the species unfolded in 1844 on the remote Icelandic island of Eldey. There, the last known breeding pair of great auks was captured and killed by hunters who were reportedly acting on behalf of a collector seeking specimens. The birds were strangled, and the single egg present at the site was accidentally crushed during the encounter. With that moment, one of the North Atlantic's most distinctive seabirds disappeared forever. Unlike some earlier extinctions that faded gradually into uncertainty, the end of the great auk is chilling precisely because it was so directly witnessed and recorded. In retrospect, the great auk's extinction reveals several patterns that would repeat in later environmental crises. The species was not ecologically fragile in its original environment. It had survived dramatic climate fluctuations and natural predation pressures for thousands of years. What it could not withstand was the combination of commercial exploitation, technological mobility, and the absence of regulatory limits on harvest. Perhaps most haunting is the psychological dimension of the story. Even as the species became visibly rare, demand for specimens increased rather than decreased. Rarity itself became a market driver, a pattern that conservationists would later recognize as particularly dangerous for vulnerable species. Today, the great auk survives only in preserved skins, skeletal remains, and scattered historical illustrations. Yet its legacy extends far beyond museum collections. Its extinction played a quiet but important role in the early development of modern conservation awareness in Europe and North America. It demonstrated with uncomfortable clarity that even abundant marine birds could be erased within a relatively short historical window if human extraction scaled faster than biological. The story of the Carolina parakeet is one of the most quietly tragic extinction events in North American history, not because the species disappeared in deep prehistory, but because it vanished within the reach of modern memory, photography, and early scientific observation. The Carolina parakeet, scientifically known as Conuropsis carolinensis, was once the only native parrot species of the eastern United States. Unlike the tropical parrots many people associate with dense rainforests, This bird thrived across a wide range of environments, from the wooded river valleys of the Midwest to the humid forests of the Southeast. Its bright green body, yellow head, and orange facial markings made it one of the most visually striking birds in North America, and unfortunately, one of the most conspicuous targets as human settlement expanded. For centuries before large-scale European colonization, the Carolina parakeet appears to have maintained stable populations across its range. It lived in social flocks, nested in tree cavities, and fed on seeds, fruits, and agricultural crops. It was particularly associated with bottomland forests and river systems, environments that would later undergo some of the most aggressive transformation during 19th century expansion. As with many extinction stories, the species' natural behavior contained a hidden vulnerability. Carolina parakeets were highly social and strongly attached to their flock members. When one bird was injured or killed, others often returned to the site, circling and calling rather than immediately fleeing. Under natural conditions, this social cohesion had advantages. Under sustained human hunting pressure, it became devastatingly maladaptive. By the early 19th century, the pressures on the species began to multiply. Large-scale deforestation for agriculture and timber steadily reduced the mature forests the birds depended on for nesting. At the same time, farmers increasingly viewed the parakeets as crop pests, particularly in orchards. Shooting the birds became common practice in some regions. Their bright plumage also made them attractive targets for the millinery trade, which demanded colorful feathers for women's hats during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These overlapping pressures, habitat loss, direct hunting, and feather trade exploitation, created a slow but persistent population decline. Yet what makes the Carolina parakeet's extinction particularly unsettling is how poorly the collapse was documented in real time. Unlike the passenger pigeon, whose enormous flocks made its decline highly visible, the parakeet disappeared more quietly in fragmented regional losses that did not immediately trigger widespread alarm. Early naturalists noted shrinking populations, but the process unfolded unevenly across its range. By the late 1800s, the species had already vanished from large portions of the northern United States. Still, no comprehensive conservation response emerged. Another possible contributing factor, still debated among researchers, was disease. Some evidence suggests that poultry pathogens introduced by expanding domestic agriculture may have spread to wild parakeet populations. While this hypothesis remains difficult to confirm definitively, it highlights the complex web of pressures that often converge in extinction events. Rarely is there a single cause. More often, multiple stressors accumulate until the species can no longer recover. The final confirmed individual of the species, a captive bird named Incas, died at the Cincinnati Zoo in 1918, just 4 years after Martha, the last passenger pigeon, died in the same facility. This coincidence is historically striking. Within a single generation, North America lost both its most abundant native bird and its only native parrot. Yet the Carolina parakeet's disappearance never fully penetrated public consciousness in the way the passenger pigeon's collapse did. Its extinction was quieter, more fragmented, and therefore in some ways more haunting. Today, the Carolina parakeet exists only in museum skins, preserved specimens, and scattered written accounts. No confirmed wild sightings have occurred for more than a century. Its loss represents not only the disappearance of a species, but the erasure of a unique ecological role from the forests of eastern North America. More broadly, its story reveals a recurring and uncomfortable pattern in environmental history. Extinction does not always announce itself with dramatic population crashes. Sometimes it proceeds through slow fragmentation, local disappearances, and a gradual normalization of absence. Until one day, the silence is permanent. The story of the moa is one of the most dramatic examples of rapid human-driven extinction in pre-modern history, not because the birds were fragile or already declining, but because they had dominated their environment for millions of years before humans arrived and then vanished within only a few centuries. The moa were a group of large, flightless birds native to New Zealand, belonging to the order Dinornithiformes. Unlike many extinction stories that unfold across long industrial timelines, the disappearance of the moa occurred in a relatively compressed historical window, following the arrival of Polynesian settlers, the ancestors of the Maori, in the late 13th century. This makes the moa one of the clearest case studies of how quickly human expansion can reshape isolated ecosystems that evolved without land-based mammalian predators. Before human arrival, New Zealand was an ecological world apart. For tens of millions of years, the islands developed in extreme isolation. Terrestrial mammals were almost entirely absent, and birds filled many of the ecological roles that mammals occupied elsewhere. In this unique environment, moa diversified into multiple species ranging dramatically in size. The largest, such as Dinornis robustus, could reach heights of over 3 meters when the neck was fully extended, making them among the tallest birds that ever lived. Despite their size, moa were herbivores, browsing on leaves, twigs, and forest vegetation. With no native human hunters and few natural predators beyond the massive Haast's eagle, they evolved with little behavioral fear of ground-based threats. This long period of evolutionary calm created the same hidden vulnerability seen in several other island extinctions. The moa were biologically successful within their original ecosystem, but were poorly prepared for sudden, sustained human predation. When Polynesian settlers reached New Zealand around the late 1200s, they encountered large, slow-moving birds that had never evolved defensive strategies against coordinated human hunters. Archaeological evidence from early Maori settlement sites reveals extensive moa bone deposits, many showing clear butchering marks. These remains indicate that moa quickly became a major food source for the growing human population. What makes the moa extinction particularly striking is the speed of the collapse. Based on radiocarbon dating and archaeological patterns, most moa species appear to have been driven to extinction within roughly 150 to 200 years after sustained human hunting began. In evolutionary terms, this is an extremely rapid disappearance for such large animals. Several factors likely accelerated the decline. First, moa reproduction rates were relatively slow, meaning populations could not quickly replace heavy losses. Second, widespread burning of forests by early settlers altered key habitats. Third, the birds' lack of evolved fear responses made them highly vulnerable to organized hunting strategies. Unlike some later extinction events, the moa vanished before the age of photography or detailed biological monitoring. There are no direct visual records of living moa. Everything we know about their appearance and behavior comes from skeletal remains, preserved eggshell fragments, coprolites, and early Maori oral traditions that appear to reference encounters with the birds. Yet even without photographs, the ecological impact of their disappearance is unmistakable. The extinction of the moa triggered cascading changes throughout New Zealand's ecosystem. Most notably, it contributed directly to the extinction of the Haast's eagle, the giant raptor that had specialized in hunting moa. With its primary prey gone, the eagle itself soon followed into extinction, a powerful example of how removing one dominant species can destabilize entire ecological networks. The moa story also carries a subtle psychological lesson that resonates strongly with modern environmental history. The Polynesian settlers who hunted the birds were not industrial exploiters operating with modern technology. They were skilled navigators and hunters using relatively simple tools compared to later colonial societies. Yet even at this earlier technological level, sustained human pressure proved sufficient to eliminate multiple large species in a short time frame. This reveals an uncomfortable truth. Large-scale extinction does not always require modern industry. Under the right ecological conditions, particularly on isolated islands, even pre-industrial human expansion can produce irreversible biological consequences. Today, the moa survives only through reconstructed skeletons in museums and the growing body of paleogenetic research that continues to refine our understanding of these remarkable birds. But their disappearance remains one of the clearest historical warnings about the fragility of isolated ecosystems when confronted with sudden human arrival. For millions of years, the story of Haast's eagle is one of the most extraordinary and haunting predator extinctions in the natural world, because it represents the sudden disappearance of a truly dominant apex hunter that had ruled its ecosystem for thousands of years. Known scientifically as Hieraetus moorei, formerly Harpagornis moorei, Haast's eagle was native exclusively to New Zealand and is widely considered the largest eagle that has ever existed. With an estimated wingspan reaching up to 3 meters and powerful talons capable of exerting immense crushing force, this bird was not merely a large raptor by modern standards. It was a specialized megafaunal predator, uniquely adapted to hunt prey far larger than those targeted by most living eagles today. For millions of years before human arrival, New Zealand evolved in relative isolation, producing one of the most unusual ecological systems on Earth. With no native land mammals except a few species of bats, birds came to dominate nearly every major ecological niche. The moa, a group of large, flightless herbivorous birds, filled the role that large grazing mammals occupied elsewhere. In response, Haast's eagle evolved into a powerful aerial hunter, capable of bringing down prey several times its own body weight. This predator-prey relationship between eagle and moa formed one of the most remarkable examples of island-driven evolutionary specialization ever documented. Physically, Haast's eagle combined relatively broad wings with an extremely robust body and disproportionately massive talons. Unlike soaring eagles that rely on wide open skies, this species was adapted for rapid ambush attacks within forested environments. Paleobiological analysis suggests it likely hunted by diving at high speed from above, using its weight and talon strength to deliver a catastrophic impact strike to the back or pelvis of large moa. Some reconstructions indicate that a full-grown Haast's eagle could kill prey weighing well over 100 kilograms. In the pre-human ecosystem of New Zealand, there were no other predators capable of challenging its dominance. For thousands of years, this system remained stable. But like many highly specialized apex predators, Haast's eagle depended heavily on the continued abundance of its primary prey. When Polynesian settlers, the ancestors of the Maori, arrived in New Zealand in the late 13th century, they began hunting moa extensively for food. Archaeological evidence shows that within roughly 150 to 200 years, most moa species had been driven to extinction. This rapid collapse of the eagle's primary food source triggered a classic top predator vulnerability. Without sufficient large prey, Haast's eagle faced a severe ecological bottleneck. Unlike more flexible predators that can shift to smaller prey, Haast's eagle appears to have been highly specialized for hunting large-bodied birds. As moa populations plummeted, the eagle's ability to sustain viable breeding populations likely declined sharply. Habitat changes caused by widespread forest burning by early human settlers may have compounded the pressure by altering hunting environments. Within a relatively short historical window, likely by the 15th century, Haast's eagle itself disappeared. What makes this extinction particularly chilling is how it illustrates the cascading nature of ecological collapse. Humans did not directly hunt Haast's eagle to extinction at large scale. Instead, by removing the foundational prey species, they destabilized the predator's entire survival framework. This indirect extinction pathway is one of the most important lessons embedded in the story. Ecosystems are not collections of isolated species, they are tightly interdependent networks. When a dominant herbivore disappears, the apex predator that depends on it may quietly follow. There is also a powerful psychological dimension to the Haast's eagle narrative. For the early Maori settlers, the moa represented an obvious and valuable food source. The eagle, far more elusive and less frequently encountered, likely did not initially appear to be under comparable threat. Yet the fate of the predator was already sealed once the prey base collapsed below a critical threshold. This delayed feedback effect is common in ecological systems and often difficult for human observers to recognize in real time. Today, Haast's eagle survives only through fossil remains, skeletal reconstructions, and a growing body of biomechanical research that continues to refine our understanding of its remarkable hunting capabilities. Yet its disappearance remains one of the clearest examples of how quickly even the most dominant predators can vanish when their ecological foundations are disrupted. For thousands of years, Haast's eagle ruled the skies of New Zealand without serious competition. Then, within just a few human generations, the balance shifted, and the largest eagle the world has ever known slipped permanently. The story of the quagga is one of the most visually striking and psychologically revealing extinction narratives of the modern era, because it involves an animal that lived close enough to the present to be photographed, studied, and even displayed in zoos, yet still slipped into extinction within the span of a few human generations. The quagga, scientifically known as Equus quagga, was a subspecies of the plains zebra that once inhabited the semi-arid grasslands of southern Africa, particularly in what is now South Africa. What made the quagga instantly recognizable was its unusual and asymmetrical appearance. Unlike the fully striped plains zebra, the quagga had bold, dark stripes across the head and neck that gradually faded into a mostly plain brown body toward the rear. This unique pattern gave the animal an almost transitional look, as if evolution itself had paused midway through the striping process. For thousands of years before large-scale European colonization of southern Africa, quagga populations appear to have remained relatively stable within their native ecosystem. They lived in herds across open grasslands and likely played a normal ecological role similar to other grazing equids. However, the 19th century brought rapid environmental and economic changes that dramatically altered their survival prospects. As European settlers expanded agricultural and pastoral activity across the region, competition for grazing land intensified. Quaggas were increasingly viewed not as wildlife components of the ecosystem, but as direct competitors with livestock, particularly sheep and cattle. This perception marked the beginning of sustained, systematic pressure on the population. Unlike some earlier extinctions that unfolded through ecological cascades alone, the quagga's decline was driven heavily by direct human hunting combined with habitat encroachment. Large numbers were shot both for their hides and to reduce perceived competition with domesticated animals. Because quaggas lived in relatively accessible open terrain and did not initially display extreme wariness toward mounted hunters armed with firearms, harvesting them became disturbingly efficient. At the time, there was little widespread recognition that the population was finite. As with the passenger pigeon in North America, abundance created a dangerous illusion of inexhaustibility. What makes the quagga's story particularly haunting is how late serious concern emerged. By the mid to late 19th century, wild populations had already declined sharply across much of their range. Yet systematic conservation measures were virtually non-existent. The species was still common enough in memory that its disappearance did not immediately trigger widespread alarm. Meanwhile, a small number of individuals were captured for zoos in Europe, where they became objects of scientific curiosity and public display. Among these was the most famous individual, a female quagga that would later become the last known member of the subspecies. In 1883, at the Artis Zoo in Amsterdam, the final known quagga died in captivity. At the time of her death, the full significance of the loss was not yet widely understood. Only afterward did naturalists fully grasp that the subspecies had completely vanished from the wild. The quagga thus became one of the first extinct animals to have been photographed alive, a detail that gives its story a particularly modern and unsettling edge. Unlike the dodo or the moa, which exist primarily in drawings and bones, the quagga's living image survives in early photography, making its disappearance feel uncomfortably recent. In the 20th century, the quagga gained renewed scientific attention when genetic analysis confirmed its close relationship to the plains zebra. This discovery reshaped understanding of the animal, revealing that it was not a separate species, but a geographically distinct subspecies with a unique striping pattern. In response, the Quagga Project was launched in South Africa in an attempt to selectively breed plains zebras that display reduced striping patterns similar to the original quagga. While these efforts have produced animals that visually resemble historical quaggas, the original genetic lineage remains extinct. The project itself has become a powerful symbol of both scientific ambition and the irreversible nature of true extinction. The quagga's disappearance carries a particularly modern psychological lesson. Unlike prehistoric megafauna losses, its extinction occurred during a period when scientific institutions, photography, and global communication already existed. The warning signs were visible. The decline was observable. Yet coordinated protection came too late. This places the quagga at a critical historical threshold, close enough to modern awareness to feel preventable, yet early enough that conservation systems had not fully matured. Today, the quagga survives only in museum. The story of Steller's sea cow is one of the most astonishingly rapid large animal extinctions ever recorded, not because the species had been declining for millennia, but because it was discovered by science and driven to extinction within the span of a single human lifetime. The animal, scientifically known as Hydrodamalus gigas, was an enormous marine herbivore belonging to the same broader group as modern manatees and dugongs. Yet in scale and ecological presence, Steller's sea cow was something far more imposing. Fully grown individuals could reach lengths of up to 8 or 9 meters and weigh several tons, making them among the largest herbivorous marine mammals of the Holocene epoch. For thousands of years before human contact, Steller's sea cows inhabited the cold coastal waters of the North Pacific, particularly around the Commander Islands near the Bering Sea. Their evolutionary history suggests that they were once more widely distributed, but by the time Europeans encountered them in the 18th century, their range had already contracted to this relatively isolated region. In this remote environment, the animals had evolved a slow-moving, near-surface feeding lifestyle, grazing primarily on kelp forests in shallow coastal waters. With thick, bark-like skin, paddle-shaped forelimbs, and no true dorsal fin, they were highly specialized for this niche. Crucially, they had no significant natural predators in their final habitat and appear to have evolved with very little fear of large surface threats. This ecological calm ended abruptly in 1741 when the German naturalist Georg Wilhelm Steller encountered the species during the ill-fated expedition of Danish explorer Vitus Bering. Steller's detailed descriptions provided the first scientific record of the animal, noting both its immense size and its notably gentle, slow-moving behavior. Ironically, the same traits that allowed the species to thrive for millennia in predator-poor waters made it extraordinarily vulnerable to human exploitation. The animals were large, floated when killed, and could be approached and harpooned with relative ease from small boats. What followed was one of the fastest documented megafaunal collapses in recorded history. News of the animal's abundance and the high value of its meat and fat spread quickly among fur traders, sailors, and hunters operating in the North Pacific. Steller's sea cow provided an exceptionally rich food source for crews traveling through the harsh Bering Sea region. Because the species had an extremely limited geographic range and likely reproduced slowly, it was biologically incapable of sustaining even moderate sustained harvesting pressure. Within just 27 years of its scientific discovery, the species was gone. The last confirmed sighting of Steller's sea cow occurred in 1768. From first detailed description to total extinction, the entire documented history of the species fits within less than 3 decades. This compression in time is what makes the story so uniquely unsettling. Many extinction narratives involve long, gradual declines that only become obvious in retrospect. Steller's sea cow, by contrast, demonstrates how quickly a large, well-established species can disappear once intensive human exploitation reaches an isolated and biologically unprepared population. Another important dimension of this extinction lies in its geographic isolation. Because the remaining population was confined to the Commander Islands, there was no broader refuge where surviving individuals could retreat. Once local numbers dropped below a viable threshold, recovery became impossible. This pattern, heavy exploitation combined with restricted range, has since been recognized as one of the most dangerous extinction risk profiles in conservation biology. There is also a profound psychological aspect to the sea cow's story. Unlike earlier prehistoric extinctions, this event occurred during the early modern scientific age. Steller himself reportedly recognized the vulnerability of the species and documented its behavior in unusually careful detail. Yet, even with direct observation and written warning, no protective measures were implemented in time. The economic incentives driving hunting were immediate and powerful, while the concept of marine conservation was still largely undeveloped. The result was a tragic mismatch between awareness and action, a pattern that would repeat in later environmental crises. Today, Steller's sea cow survives only through skeletal remains, historical illustrations, and Steller's original written accounts. No living photographs exist. No preserved soft tissue remains comparable to those of the woolly mammoth have been found. Its disappearance remains one of the clearest examples of how rapidly human expansion can erase even the largest and most seemingly secure animals when biological vulnerability, geographic isolation, and economic exploitation converge. In the cold, the story of the Irish elk is one of the most visually dramatic extinction cases of the late Ice Age, largely because of the animal's extraordinary antlers, which remain among the most impressive biological structures ever produced by a terrestrial mammal. Despite its common name, the Irish elk was not actually an elk in the modern sense, nor was it limited to Ireland. Scientifically known as Megaloceros giganteus, this giant deer once ranged across vast parts of Eurasia, from Western Europe to Siberia. Its association with Ireland comes primarily from the unusually rich fossil deposits preserved in Irish peat bogs, which have yielded some of the most complete and well-known skeletons. At its peak, the Irish elk was one of the largest deer species ever to exist. Adult males stood roughly 2 meters at the shoulder, but what truly defined the species were its enormous antlers, which could span over 3.5 meters from tip to tip and weigh up to 40 kilograms. These antlers were not weapons of predation, but structures shaped primarily by sexual selection. Like many modern deer, males likely used them in visual display and ritualized combat during mating competition. In the open steppe and parkland environments of the late Pleistocene, such oversized antlers were not necessarily a disadvantage. In fact, they may have been highly effective signals of genetic fitness in relatively open landscapes where visibility was high. For much of the late Ice Age, Irish elk populations appear to have been stable and widespread. The species thrived in the cold, open environments that dominated large parts of Eurasia during glacial periods. However, as the climate began to warm at the end of the last Ice Age, roughly 11,000 years ago, the ecological landscape underwent major transformation. Expanding forests gradually replaced the open grasslands and sparse woodlands that had previously supported large grazing herbivores. This shift altered food availability, movement patterns, and mating displays for many large mammals, including the Irish elk. For many years, a popular but oversimplified theory suggested that the Irish elk drove itself to extinction because its antlers became too large and energetically costly to maintain, an example of evolution overshooting practical limits. Modern research, however, has largely moved away from this idea. While the antlers were indeed massive, isotopic analysis of fossil remains suggests that Irish elk were generally well-nourished during much of their existence. Instead, the more widely accepted explanation involves a combination of environmental change and human pressure. As forests expanded and climate patterns shifted, suitable open habitat likely became increasingly fragmented. At the same time, anatomically modern humans were spreading across Eurasia, and archaeological evidence indicates that Irish elk were occasionally hunted. Unlike some rapid historical extinctions, the disappearance of the Irish elk appears to have been regionally uneven. Populations declined earlier in Western Europe, but persisted longer in eastern refugia, such as parts of Siberia. The final known populations likely disappeared around 7,000 to 8,000 years ago. This staggered extinction pattern suggests a gradual ecological squeeze rather than a single catastrophic collapse. Large-bodied mammals with slow reproductive cycles are particularly vulnerable to this kind of cumulative pressure, where multiple moderate stressors combine over time. The Irish elk occupies a fascinating position in extinction studies because it highlights how visually dramatic anatomy can sometimes mislead interpretation. Early researchers were captivated by the sheer scale of the antlers and often assumed they must have been the primary cause of the species' demise. But deeper ecological and isotopic research has revealed a more complex story. The elk did not simply evolve itself into extinction. Instead, it appears to have been caught in a shifting environmental landscape where climate warming, habitat transformation, and human expansion gradually narrowed its viable ecological space. There is also an important symbolic dimension to the Irish elk. Its enormous antlers, preserved in museums across Europe, have become one of the most recognizable icons of Ice Age megafauna. They represent both the power and the vulnerability of highly specialized large mammals living in rapidly changing environments. For thousands of years, the Irish elk dominated its ecological niche across vast territories. Yet even such an imposing animal proved unable to adapt quickly enough to the combined pressures of post-glacial environmental change and growing human presence. The story of the aurochs is one of the most historically intimate extinction narratives because, unlike many vanished Ice Age giants, this animal lived alongside human civilization for thousands of years and played a direct role in the origins of one of humanity's most important domesticated species. The aurochs, scientifically known as Bos primigenius, was the wild ancestor of modern domestic cattle. For millennia, it roamed across a vast range, extending from Western Europe through the Middle East and into parts of Asia and North Africa. It was not a marginal or isolated species. It was a dominant large herbivore, deeply embedded in the ecological and cultural landscapes of early human societies. Physically, the aurochs was far more imposing than most modern cattle. Adult males could stand up to 1.8 meters at the shoulder, with long, forward-curving horns and a muscular, athletic build adapted for open and semi-forested environments. Contemporary descriptions and skeletal analysis suggest that the animal was fast-moving, highly alert, and capable of aggressive defense when threatened. Unlike modern domesticated cattle, which have been selectively bred for docility and productivity, the aurochs retained the full behavioral intensity of a wild megafaunal grazer. For thousands of years during the Holocene, aurochs populations coexisted with expanding human agricultural societies. In fact, one of the most consequential developments in human history, the domestication of cattle, emerged directly from early human interaction with aurochs populations in the Near East around 10,000 years ago. Over time, domesticated cattle spread widely across human settlements, gradually replacing the ecological and economic role once occupied by their wild ancestors. Yet the wild aurochs itself continued to survive in shrinking pockets across Europe for many centuries. The long decline of the aurochs illustrates a different extinction pattern than the rapid collapses seen in species like the passenger pigeon or Steller's sea cow. Instead of disappearing within decades, the aurochs experienced a slow but persistent contraction of its range. As agriculture expanded, forests were cleared, wetlands were drained, and human-managed landscapes increasingly dominated Europe. Large wild herbivores require extensive territory and relatively undisturbed grazing systems. As human land use intensified, suitable habitat for aurochs steadily diminished. At the same time, the animals were hunted both for meat and as symbols of prestige. Historical records from medieval Europe suggest that aurochs hunting was sometimes associated with elite status, further increasing pressure on already fragmented populations. Unlike earlier prehistoric hunters, medieval societies possessed more efficient weapons and more organized land control, making long-term survival increasingly difficult for the remaining herds. By the late Middle Ages, aurochs populations had been reduced to a few isolated refugees, most notably in the royal hunting forests of Poland. These final herds were protected for a time by legal restrictions, effectively becoming managed wildlife rather than fully wild populations. However, even this protection proved insufficient in the long run. Disease transmitted from domestic cattle, continued habitat pressure, and the inherent vulnerability of such a small genetic population gradually pushed the species toward its final threshold. The last known aurochs died in 1627 in the Jaktorow forest of Poland. Unlike many prehistoric extinctions, this event occurred well within the era of written records, giving the aurochs one of the most precisely documented extinction endpoints among large European mammals. Its disappearance marked the end of the original wild lineage that had given rise to the billions of cattle that now exist worldwide. The aurochs holds a uniquely paradoxical place in human environmental history. Biologically, the species is extinct, yet genetically its legacy persists in every domestic cow. In a sense, the aurochs did not vanish completely. It was absorbed into human agriculture and transformed into something else. This dual fate makes the aurochs different from many other extinct megafauna. It was not only eliminated by human expansion, it was also partially preserved through domestication, though in a fundamentally altered form. In recent decades, several breeding-back projects have attempted to recreate animals that physically resemble the original aurochs by selectively breeding primitive cattle breeds. While some results approximate the appearance of the wild ancestor, the true aurochs, shaped by thousands of years of natural selection in wild ecosystems, is gone. Its extinction stands as a powerful reminder that domestication and survival are not the same thing. The animal that once roamed freely across Eurasia survives only in bones, historical descriptions, and the diluted genetic echo carried within modern. The story of the Pyrenean ibex is one of the most haunting modern extinction cases because it unfolded almost entirely under scientific observation and ended not in distant prehistory, but at the threshold of the 21st century. Known scientifically as Capra pyrenaica, the Pyrenean ibex, also called the bucardo, was a mountain-dwelling wild goat native to the rugged Pyrenees range between Spain and France. Unlike many extinct species that vanished before the development of modern conservation biology, the decline of the Pyrenean ibex was documented in real time, studied by researchers, and widely recognized as a conservation emergency. Yet despite this awareness, the subspecies still slipped into extinction, making its story particularly unsettling in the modern environmental narrative. Physically, the Pyrenean ibex was a robust and agile ungulate adapted to steep alpine terrain. Males possessed long, thick, backward-curving horns with pronounced ridges, while females were smaller and more lightly built. The animals were well suited to cold mountain environments, capable of navigating rocky slopes and sparse high-altitude vegetation. For centuries, ibex populations across the Iberian Peninsula had experienced pressure from hunting, but several regional subspecies survived into the modern era. The Pyrenean form, however, gradually became restricted to increasingly isolated pockets within the Spanish Pyrenees. By the 19th and early 20th centuries, the subspecies was already in visible decline. Overhunting, habitat disturbance, and competition with domestic livestock reduced numbers steadily. Although legal protections were eventually introduced in parts of its range, these measures came late and were often insufficiently enforced. By the late 20th century, the population had collapsed to just a handful of individuals. Conservationists recognized the severity of the situation, but the small population size created a biological trap. With so few animals remaining, genetic diversity plummeted, and the likelihood of natural recovery diminished sharply. By the 1990s, the entire subspecies was reduced to a single known surviving individual, a female named Celia. She lived under close monitoring in Ordesa National Park in Spain and became one of the most closely watched wild animals in Europe. Her existence represented both a symbol of last hope and a stark indicator of how narrow the margin for recovery had become. On January 6, 2000, Celia was found dead, reportedly killed by a falling tree. With her death, the Pyrenean ibex became the first mammal subspecies to go extinct in the 21st century. What makes this story even more extraordinary is what happened next. In 2003, scientists attempted one of the earliest de-extinction efforts by cloning the Pyrenean ibex using preserved genetic material. For a brief moment, the effort appeared successful. A cloned kid was born, marking the first time an extinct animal had been technically brought back to life. However, the newborn died within minutes due to lung defects. The species had, in a sense, crossed back over the biological threshold only to vanish again almost immediately. This fleeting resurrection remains one of the most symbolically powerful moments in modern conservation history. The Pyrenean ibex illustrates a different extinction pattern than many earlier cases. It did not vanish suddenly due to industrial-scale hunting, nor was it lost in deep prehistoric climate shifts. Instead, it declined slowly in full view of modern science. Warning signs were clear, protective laws existed, monitoring systems were in place, yet the combination of late intervention, genetic bottleneck, and accumulated human pressure proved too much to reverse. In many ways, the bucardo represents the modern face of extinction, not ignorance, but delayed and insufficient response. Today, the Pyrenean ibex survives only in museum specimens, preserved DNA samples, and the brief scientific record of its attempted return. Its disappearance stands as a sobering reminder that awareness alone does not guarantee survival. Even in the age of conservation biology and genetic technology, species can still slip past the point of recovery if intervention comes too late. Among modern extinction stories, few are as quietly unsettling as the bucardo, the mountain goat that humanity tried for a moment to bring back from the edge, only to watch it disappear again into silence. The story of the Irish elk is one of the most visually dramatic extinction cases of the late Ice Age, largely because of the animal's extraordinary antlers, which remain among the most impressive biological structures ever produced by a terrestrial mammal. Despite its common name, the Irish elk was not actually an elk in the modern sense, nor was it limited to Ireland. Scientifically known as Megaloceros giganteus, this giant deer once ranged across vast parts of Eurasia, from Western Europe to Siberia. Its association with Ireland comes primarily from the unusually rich fossil deposits preserved in Irish peat bogs, which have yielded some of the most complete and well-known skeletons. At its peak, the Irish elk was one of the largest deer species ever to exist. Adult males stood roughly 2 meters at the shoulder, but what truly defined the species were its enormous antlers, which could span over 3.5 meters from tip to tip and weigh up to 40 kilograms. These antlers were not weapons of predation, but structures shaped primarily by sexual selection. Like many modern deer, males likely used them in visual display and ritualized combat during mating competition. In the open steppe and parkland environments of the late Pleistocene, such oversized antlers were not necessarily a disadvantage. In fact, they may have been highly effective signals of genetic fitness in relatively open landscapes where visibility was high. For much of the late Ice Age, Irish elk populations appear to have been stable and widespread. The species thrived in the cold, open environments that dominated large parts of Eurasia during glacial periods. However, as the climate began to warm at the end of the last Ice Age, roughly 11,000 years ago, the ecological landscape underwent major transformation. Expanding forests gradually replaced the open grasslands and sparse woodlands that had previously supported large grazing herbivores. This shift altered food availability, movement patterns, and mating displays for many large mammals, including the Irish elk. For many years, a popular but oversimplified theory suggested that the Irish elk drove itself to extinction because its antlers became too large and energetically costly to maintain, an example of evolution overshooting practical limits. Modern research, however, has largely moved away from this idea. While the antlers were indeed massive, isotopic analysis of fossil remains suggests that Irish elk were generally well-nourished during much of their existence. Instead, the more widely accepted explanation involves a combination of environmental change and human pressure. As forests expanded and climate patterns shifted, suitable open habitat likely became increasingly fragmented. At the same time, anatomically modern humans were spreading across Eurasia, and archaeological evidence indicates that Irish elk were occasionally hunted. Unlike some rapid historical extinctions, the disappearance of the Irish elk appears to have been regionally uneven. Populations declined earlier in Western Europe, but persisted longer in eastern refugia, such as parts of Siberia. The final known populations likely disappeared around 7,000 to 8,000 years ago. This staggered extinction pattern suggests a gradual ecological squeeze rather than a single catastrophic collapse. Large-bodied mammals with slow reproductive cycles are particularly vulnerable to this kind of cumulative pressure, where multiple moderate stressors combine over time. The Irish elk occupies a fascinating position in extinction studies because it highlights how visually dramatic anatomy can sometimes mislead interpretation. Early researchers were captivated by the sheer scale of the antlers and often assumed they must have been the primary cause of the species' demise. But deeper ecological and isotopic research has revealed a more complex story. The elk did not simply evolve itself into extinction. Instead, it appears to have been caught in a shifting environmental landscape where climate warming, habitat transformation, and human expansion gradually narrowed its viable ecological space. There is also an important symbolic dimension to the Irish elk. Its enormous antlers, preserved in museums across Europe, have become one of the most recognizable icons of Ice Age megafauna. They represent both the power and the vulnerability of highly specialized large mammals living in rapidly changing environments. For thousands of years, the Irish elk dominated its ecological niche across vast territories. Yet even such an imposing animal proved unable to adapt quickly enough to the combined pressures of post-glacial environmental change and growing human presence. And so, one by one, they disappeared. Not always in fire, not always in catastrophe, sometimes in silence. The dodo stopped walking its island paths. The mammoth vanished into melting ice. The thylacine paced behind bars. And then no more. The baiji swam the Yangtze for millions of years until the river grew too loud. History often tells us about empires that fell, kings who ruled, and battles that changed the world. But just as important and far more quiet are the lives that faded while humanity was busy building its future. Extinction is rarely a single moment. It is a process, a narrowing, a series of small pressures that, over time, become irreversible. And the most unsettling truth is this. In many of these stories, we were already watching. We had the reports, we had the warnings. Sometimes, we even had the last photograph. Yet still, the silence came. But history is not only a record of loss, it is also a mirror. Because the question these animals leave behind is not only what happened to them, but also, what patterns are we repeating now? Which warnings are we ignoring today? And how many species are quietly approaching the same edge? While the world looks elsewhere? If this story made you pause, if it made you see history a little differently, and if you want more deep, unsettling journeys into the hidden patterns of the past, subscribe to the Enigmatic Veil. Because here, we don't just tell history, we uncover the mechanisms behind it. New historical and philosophical deep dives are coming, stories that most channels overlook, patterns most people miss, and questions that still matter today. Until the next veil is lifted.